"Excuse me, but today he will be giving the presentation." I doubted my ears at my Mr. Johnson's words. "Hey high school grad, we have an important presentation today. Follow me." I was suddenly ordered to follow without any prior notice at a business meeting. I wasn't given any details beforehand about what kind of project it was or what kind of client we were dealing with. Despite that, I was tasked with giving the presentation and my mind went blank. However, causing a scene here would bring shame to the company. I made up my mind, looked through the documents, and began explaining while utilizing the projector. Somehow, I finished the presentation and the beautiful CEO of the client company praised me. "That was an excellent presentation." I never expected to be complimented by someone in the position of CEO. As I was feeling embarrassed, my Mr. Johnson interjected, No, this guy is just an incompetent newbie." I felt irritated but endured it so as not to show it on my face. The Mr. Johnson always looks down on me, but he doesn't know. He doesn't know what kind of events will befall him after this. My name is Sanders, currently 30 years old. I belong to the sales department of a company. After graduating from high school, I chose to work instead of going to college. However, I haven't been working at my current company since I was a new graduate. For reasons, I quit my previous place and joined here as a mid-career hire. It's only been about half a year since I joined here, so I may not be a full-fledged employee yet, but I'm getting used to the job. The day may come soon when I'll be entrusted with bigger tasks. While feeling a mix of anticipation and anxiety, I worked diligently every day. My seniors are all kind and respectable people. If there's anything you don't understand, feel free to ask. Sanders, the documents you made are very easy to read. Thank you. They kindly teach me when I don't understand something and praise me when I do well. It's no exaggeration to say that my desire to become like my seniors is the driving force behind my work. If I had a tail, it would surely be wagging excitedly like a dog's when I interact with them. However, there was one thing that worried me. That was Mr. Johnson of the sales department. He is my boss. He keeps treating me like a newbie. Admittedly, it's only been half a year since I joined a company, so I may still be a rookie in his eyes, but I think he could give me more opportunities for growth. By the way, being treated like a newbie is not in a good way, but in a bad way. Hey, a high school grad can handle such difficult work, right? Why don't you just do menial tasks? He'd come up to me while I was preparing documents, laugh through his nose, and interrupt my work. Even when I submit the documents I worked hard on, he only says heartless things like, "How can I show high school grads documents to our clients?" It's embarrassing. Mr. Johnson's eyes clearly showed contempt when looking at me. He's a typical academic elitist. Since he graduated from a decent university, he always looked down on me because I am a high school graduate. He rarely calls me Sanders properly, and usually calls me high school grad or newbie with a mocking tone. Can't you even make documents properly? Can't be helped because you're a high school grad. There were countless times I wanted to glare at him as he grinned, but I endured the urge and clenched my fists so hard my nails dug into my palms to vent my anger without him noticing. Mr. Johnson negates everything I do. He finds fault with the documents I submit, not because there are points to improve, but simply because he wants to ridicule me. Before submitting them to Mr. Johnson, I have a few seniors check them over, and they all praise me, saying, "It's well organized and easy to read. There's nothing to fix, and you're doing great." I gotta step up my game too. They're the kind of people who would think about points of reflection together with me if I made a mistake, so I don't think they're just flattering me. The only one who criticizes me is Mr. Johnson, and since he doesn't give specific points, I know it's just nitpicking. I want to push through with the work I've done well, but it doesn't go that way. Understood, I'll revise it. I end up having to say that, remake it, and submit it again until he says something like, "Well, I guess this is fine." He doesn't really look over what I make. He doesn't approve it because he checked the revisions. He just stops denying it because he's bored. At this rate, I fear Mr. Johnson's behavior will keep escalating. Afraid of that, I secretly consulted a senior colleague about him. That senior is Mr. Carter, who has taught me various things as my mentor since I joined the company. I do feel like Mr. Johnson has been acting strange lately. He wasn't like that before. Mr. Carter crossed his arms and lowered his eyes as if troubled. Mr. Johnson used to be a completely normal person, apparently. He did his job normally, gave necessary guidance to his subordinates, and was there for them when they had questions. He was supposed to be a boss with no particular flaws. He wasn't the type of person to mock people based on their educational background, it seems. Hearing that, I recalled days of when I just started working at the company. Nice to meet you, Sanders. If you have any problems, don't hesitate to tell me. We're a team after all. On the first day, Mr. Johnson greeted me with a smile, the hand extended smartly. He seemed like a kind person, and I remember feeling relieved thinking we'd surely get along well as I shook his hand. Mr. Johnson and seniors trusted each other. The sales department at that time was filled with a warm atmosphere that made me want to blend in as soon as possible, and it was a comfortable place to be. Or, so it should have been. But I wonder when it became like it is now. I hung my head dejectedly. Perhaps startled by my appearance, Mr. Carter spoke with a slightly louder voice than before, saying, "But you know what? Sanders, you're doing a great job. If you keep at it, I'm sure Mr. Johnson will acknowledge you someday." His tone was bright as if trying to encourage me. I raised my face and let out a wry smile. I hope so. My anxiety didn't disappear right away, but thanks to Mr. Carter, I felt like my negative emotions had lessened a bit. I'll do my best to gain Mr. Johnson's recognition. I realized the feeling in my heart again. Another day. As I was doing desk work at my own desk, a shadow suddenly fell over it. I looked up and saw Mr. Johnson standing there. "Hey newbie, put them together." He said that while placing a mountain of files with a thud. I have no idea what's what if he tells me to put them together without any explanation. I alternated between looking at the mountain and Mr. Johnson's face, slowly opening my mouth. Which project are these documents for? Mr. Johnson didn't properly answer my question, just lifted the corner of his lips and narrowed his eyes, saying, "You'll know if you look inside. Don't ask about every little thing. Can't high school grads read English?" I knew that if I said anything back, he would keep grumbling sarcastic remarks like, "This is why high school grads are." Suppressing the urge to sigh, I brushed it off with a forced laugh, saying, "Oh, I am sorry." I decided to obediently follow Mr. Johnson's orders, but when I actually started working on it, it was incredibly difficult. It's not the kind of thing you'd assign to a subordinate you call a newbie at all. "Hey, Sanders, how's it going? Is everything okay?" Mr. Carter came to check on me, but when he looked at the contents of the files, he furrowed his brows in confusion, saying, "Whoa, this is tough. You might want to consult Mr. Johnson about this." I took his advice and mustered up the courage to consult Mr. Johnson, but he just scoffed. "Figure it out yourself. Do high school grads not have enough brains to think?" And wouldn't listen to me. With no other choice, I desperately put it together over the course of several days, researching and getting advice from seniors as much as I could, often working until the last train. "Hey high school grad, take care of this too." During that time, Mr. Johnson kept pushing unnecessary miscellaneous tasks on me, making it take even longer. "I'm sorry, I wish I could stay with you late." Mr. Carter would sometimes work overtime with me, but he has a wife and child. He apologetically told me he couldn't stay until the last train, but I'm the one who should be apologizing. "Mr. Carter, thank you so much as always." It became a routine for me to say that and for Mr. Carter to repeatedly say, "I'm sorry" as he left. Then one day, after several days had passed, I finally saw the end in sight for the work Mr. Johnson had pushed on me. A glimmer of hope shone through my hazy mind. It was around 10 p.m. There were about 2 hours left until the last train. I stretched deeply. My stiff back and shoulders made cracking sounds. I left my desk to go to the restroom and calm down. But as soon as I came out after finishing my business, I heard an engine sound from the direction of the parking lot. It's not unusual for people to commute by car at a company. Various cars line up in the employee parking lot every morning. Someone who was working overtime like me must have finished and gone home. As I returned to my desk, thinking I wanted to go home soon too, I found an unfamiliar convenience store bag placed there. "Huh? What's this?" I couldn't help but voice my thoughts. Since I'm the only one on the floor right now, even a small voice seems to echo loudly. This bag wasn't here just a little while ago. I was away from my desk for about 5 minutes. Who in the world left it in such a short time? I checked the contents of the bag. There was bagel and milk along with a handwritten note in strong, angular letters saying, "Good work. Please eat if you'd like." It's like a detective from a TV drama from a generation ago. I didn't know who left me the gift, but I gratefully ate it while finishing up my work. Mr. Johnson, I've finished compiling the files. The next day, I submit the documents I managed to create with great effort. I had no such intention at all, but I was surprised to find my voice sounding somewhat confident. Mr. Johnson may have thought I couldn't do it, but the sense of accomplishment from being able to finish it like this must have seeped through. Mr. Johnson glanced at me but just said, "Yeah, leave it there," and immediately shifted his gaze back to his computer. I was irritated, but decided to leave it there as instructed. Since I was able to finish this difficult job, maybe I'm improving my skills too. I thought this might lead to being entrusted with something else again, but for about half a month after this, my days continued to be filled with just doing my own work and Mr. Johnson's miscellaneous tasks. "Hey, high school grad, we have an important presentation today. Follow me." A while after that job, I was suddenly appointed by Mr. Johnson without any prior notice. His tone left no room for argument. It was a good thing I didn't happen to have any scheduled visits, but I wish he would let me know about these things in advance. I felt inwardly indignant, but I kept my mouth shut because saying it directly would lead to trouble. "We're leaving around 10, so be ready." I checked the time. It was 9:10 a.m. I had to finish my own work as much as possible before departure. I hurriedly finished my work. The more I rushed, the faster time seemed to pass, which only fueled my impatience. Around 5 minutes before 10, I neatly arranged the scattered documents on my desk, saved my computer data, and finished my preparations. I thought Mr. Johnson would ask me to go together, but I didn't see him. Thinking he might have gone outside ahead of me, I headed to the parking lot and found him sitting comfortably in the passenger seat of the company car. "Oh, you're late." As I approached, he tossed something to me as if throwing it away. I hurriedly caught it. Inside was the car key. "You drive." In situations like this, it's common sense for the subordinate to drive, right? Mr. Johnson pointed his chin sharply at the driver's seat. He had a point. I sat in the driver's seat and put on my seat belt. After about 20 minutes of driving, we arrived at B Company, the company we were presenting to. I followed Mr. Johnson, completed the reception procedures, and was guided to the meeting room. "Please wait here," the receptionist told us, and we sat down on chairs. Since it was just Mr. Johnson and me, a mysterious tension arose within me. Should I say something? No, but if I spoke to him, he might curse at me as usual, saying, "Don't say unnecessary things, high school grad." All I could do was stare intently at the area around my knees. Perhaps due to the awkwardness, the ticking sound of the clock on the wall seemed unusually loud. My palms, which had been unknowingly gripping my slacks, were faintly sweating. How long did we wait for? It was probably actually around 10 minutes, but it felt like about an hour had passed. "Thank you for waiting." The door opened, releasing me from the tension. It's strange, being with Mr. Johnson was more suffocating than meeting a presentation client for the first time. The people who appeared were a stunningly beautiful woman and a young man who seemed to be her subordinate. Mr. Johnson and I stood up and eagerly exchanged business cards. The woman's name was Madison Thompson, and amazingly, she was the CEO of B Company. She was apparently directly handling this project, so she came to the meeting herself. "Thank you very much for coming today." When Miss Thompson showed a carefree smile, Mr. Johnson was clearly spoony on her. He was so absent-minded that I worried if he was even listening properly, and every time Miss Thompson laughed or showed elegant behavior, his cheeks flushed red and he grinned. Miss Thompson was a very friendly person and made some small talk to ease our tension. "Well then, without further ado, please begin your presentation." When the atmosphere had softened, she brought it up and the meeting began. As I was glancing sideways to see what kind of presentation Mr. Johnson would give, he said something outrageous. "Excuse me, but today senators here will be giving the presentation." I was so surprised I couldn't even speak. I could only gape my mouth open. The idea of me giving the presentation was a bolt from the blue. Even when I asked Mr. Johnson in the car on the way here what kind of client it was, what kind of project, what we would talk about. He wouldn't tell me at all. If he had told me in advance, I could have prepared. Perhaps finding my reaction strange, Miss Thompson tilted her head. The young male subordinate also turned his gaze towards me, and I became unbearably uncomfortable. Mr. Johnson gave me an additional blow. Sanders joined us less than a year ago. He's still a newbie, but don't worry, we've trained him well, and he can handle this presentation without issue. Why would he say something that raises the bar like that? I sent a gaze to Mr. Johnson, seeking for help, but he pretended not to notice and showed a satisfied grin. I could only think he had set this up to embarrass me. As if urging me on, the clock continued to mark time with the sound of its second hand. As I remained silent, anxiety seeped into Miss Thompson and the others' faces. Causing a scene here would be a company's shame. I had no choice but to comply. I made up my mind, stood up, projected the documents Mr. Johnson had given me, and pretended to adjust the screen and other settings while looking through the documents. My eyes widened. Without even looking closely, I could tell it was the documents I had made about half a month ago, the ones I had managed to complete despite the hardships. Yet the name in the document creator field had been changed to Mr. Johnson. While feeling indignant, I breathed a sigh of relief, thinking, if it's something I made myself, I should be able to explain it properly. First, I had to make them understand the overview of the project. I began explaining the documents, focusing on the key points. Instead of just keeping my gaze on my hands, I looked at Miss Thompson and the others' faces and spoke with emotion as if appealing to them. They were intently looking at the documents, so we rarely made eye contact. The presentation time was at most about 15 minutes, but it felt like the longest in my life so far. Thank you very much. When I finished my explanation, Miss Thompson raised her hand straight up. On page 7 of the document, near the bottom, it says reducing environmental impact. Could you explain specifically what that entails? She asked, but her eyes were directed not at me who had given the presentation, but at Mr. Johnson. He probably hadn't expected to be asked a question himself, so he averted his gaze and panicked. I think water. His voice cracked, and I couldn't help but think how pathetic despite him being my boss. His way of speaking was a perfect fit for the word stammering, and what he wanted to say wasn't coming across at all. I was unable to bear watching anymore. I interrupted Mr. Johnson and clearly answered. Conventionally, organic solvents were used in manufacturing, but through a special production method, it has become possible to substitute with water. This reduces the environmental impact. Also, since it's water, we expect to greatly reduce the risk of health hazards to factory workers. Then Mr. Johnson was visibly relieved, and overlapping with the end of my words, he said in a proud voice, "That's right. Exactly." I was amazed he could take that attitude despite not answering himself. Not wanting to be embarrassed in front of the beautiful Miss Thompson, Mr. Johnson put on a forced smile while sweating. Seeing his appearance, her eyebrow twitched upward. "I see. So you can substitute organic solvents with water. Does it have any negative impact on the product's finish or performance?" Miss Thompson asked another question. Again, it was directed at Mr. Johnson, not me. She had a look on her face as if she had caught onto something, and for a moment she turned to me and gave a small smile. Mr. Johnson flistered, wondering if it would continue, and said, Negative impact. Well, I can't say for sure there isn't any, but..." He had stopped trying to keep up appearances, and wrinkles formed between his brows. I interrupted again and explained, "Currently, we've been able to reproduce about 90% of the performance of the conventional product that used organic solvents. In our future development policy, we aim to get closer to 100%. Miss Thompson smiled and praised, 90% at the current stage, that's amazing. Then Mr. Johnson also looked happy and chimed in, "That's right. Even if we replace it with the current product, we expect it won't be a problem for most current applications." He seemed to want to appeal to Ms. Thompson, but did he not realize he was just spinning his wheels? She deepened her smile and told us in a cheerful voice, "We'll definitely consider it positively on our end." She was clearly looking at me, not Mr. Johnson. I was relieved it had ended without issue, despite worrying how it would turn out at one point. "Mr. Sanders, that was an excellent presentation. Who are you, really?" Thankfully, I was even able to be praised by Miss Thompson. "No, it was nothing. I never expected to be complimented by someone in the position of CEO. As I was feeling embarrassed, Mr. Johnson interjected, No, this guy is just an incompetent newbie. I felt irritated, but I endured not showing it on my face for Miss Thompson and the others' sake. The no should have been my own words. Mr. Johnson had no right to say it. Perhaps he couldn't stand seeing me, whom he usually looks down on, being praised. Miss Thompson made an openly unpleasant face at his words, but he didn't seem to notice at all. Thank you for your time today. When the meeting ended, Miss Thompson and the others saw us off to the entrance. We thanked each other many times, and we started walking towards the car. As we stepped outside B Company, a gentle breeze swayed my hair. I took a deep breath. Until just now, perhaps due to the tension, I had a feeling of tightness in my chest, but now I could breathe smoothly. I had thought I would be less nervous with the presentation client than alone with Mr. Johnson, but as expected, it's a different story when I have to give the presentation myself. In any case, I'm glad it ended without issue. I savored the sense of accomplishment and relief. While immersed in that emotion, I tried to look at the business cards by searching my pocket, but I didn't feel the familiar sensation. I seemed to have forgotten them in the meeting room. Excuse me, Mr. Johnson. I forgot something, so I'm going to get it. Geez, high school grads are so clumsy. Hurry up. Ignoring Mr. Johnson, who never forgets to be sarcastic, I jogged back. Then, just as I reached the entrance, I almost ran into someone trying to come out. Eek. You startled me. Sorry. I somehow avoided them and looked at their face. It was a flustered Miss Thompson. In her hand was my business card holder. She had apparently been trying to deliver it to me in a hurry. This is yours, right, Mr. Centers? Yes, I just noticed I had forgotten it. Thank you for bringing it to me. I thanked her and said see you again. As I was about to turn around and start running, Miss Thompson stopped me, saying, Mr. Centers. My feet stopped as if pulled by an invisible string. When I turned around, she made a certain proposal to me in a small voice. It felt like a detonator for me to work hard at a company from now on. After careful consideration, I decided to accept the proposal, saying, yes, I'd be happy to. A few days later, Mr. Johnson came to where I was taking care of miscellaneous tasks. Oh, is the incompetent high school grad doing chores? He seemed to be putting his energy into disparaging me today as well. You're the one who pushed this work on me. I thought that in my mind being appalled, but I just laughed vaguely to cover it up. Usually, more mocking words would follow, but this time it ended with just that one line. Perhaps because he was in a good mood. He was trying to return to his desk while humming and grinning. Did something happen? I asked Mr. Johnson, and he said he had just received instructions from Miss Thompson. The content was that for the next meeting, they wanted only Mr. Johnson and department manager to come. Miss Thompson said you're not invited. I guess you couldn't hide your incompetence as a high school grad. Mr. Johnson said in a sing-song voice, laughing in high spirits. He had a provocative expression, but my heart wasn't disturbed. I calmly asked, is that so? Then, regarding that project, I won't be involved from now on, right? Perhaps Mr. Johnson was finding it strange that I didn't seem frustrated or irritated. He made a puzzled face for a moment, but he quickly returned to a smile. Yay, that's right. What, you're not frustrated? I am frustrated, but I think it's better for someone with the appropriate abilities to handle large projects. I'm incompetent, as you say, Mr. Johnson. I put on a big smile that rivaled Mr. Johnson's mockery. I wonder if he noticed I emphasized the word incompetent. Huh? Oh, for an incompetent like you, you understand pretty well. Well, that's how it is. Don't butt in unnecessarily from now on. Seemingly satisfied, Mr. Johnson loudly scoffed one last time and left. As I watched his back, I moved my lips slightly and muttered softly like a gentle breeze, so no one could hear. I won't butt in at all. Even if you beg me for help, absolutely not. However, Mr. Carter in the next seat seemed to have heard me. He gave me a perplexed look, and I waved my hands in front of my face to cover it up, saying, please forget about it. It's just my way of relieving stress. Well then, since Miss Thompson called for me, I'm gonna go to the meeting. A few days later, department manager and Mr. Johnson went to a meeting at B Company. Before leaving the floor, Mr. Johnson even came all the way to me just to say that. But there was no irritation in my heart, only a feeling of anticipation for what kind of face he would return with. Thanks to that, I was able to see him off with a smile, saying, "Understood." That positive emotion became my driving force, and my work progressed smoothly. And when evening came, the department manager and the others returned. As expected, his face was pale. The department manager was walking while sighing irritably many times. As soon as he sat down heavily in his chair, the department manager propped his chin on his hand and let out an exceptionally large sigh. He tapped his foot impatiently and drummed his fingers on his desk, so a regular tapping sound echoed around. After that continued for several minutes, he finally opened his computer. But Mr. Johnson was just trembling with a pale face, unable to get any work done. The department manager was unable to hold back his irritation and scolded, "Mr. Johnson, if you're not feeling well, leave early. Just being like that will only make the atmosphere in the department worse." Mr. Johnson's shoulders shook greatly, and he left early obediently without talking back. Unlike when he went to the meeting, this time he didn't make any sarcastic remarks. The department manager, who was seeing him off, breathed a sigh of relief. Phew, it was different from the tense one earlier. More like he had let his guard down. His face had returned to its usual gentleness, and he gave me a nod. Mr. Carter and others who have been watching said nothing and seemed to have vaguely grasped the situation. Then, a few days later, Miss Thompson and her male subordinate made a surprise visit. Several employees, including me, were called. Though, the CEO and the department manager knew the circumstances and didn't seem particularly surprised. By the way, I knew too, and among those called, the only one confused was Mr. Johnson. Miss Thompson looked at my face and smiled for a moment, but immediately raised her brows and eyes, changing to an intimidating expression. The reason for our visit today is that we wanted to discuss the project that Mr. Sanders previously explained to our company, she said in a clear voice, and looked around at us. Also, she gave instructions to her subordinate waiting behind her, saying, "Please." The male subordinate took out a voice recorder and started playing the audio. It wasn't connected to speakers, so the volume wasn't that high, but it was enough for the people there to hear. "This is the audio from the meeting we had the other day without Mr. Sanders present. We recorded it with prior permission from your department manager, while the CEO, myself, and the others were standing straight and listening to the audio. Only Mr. Johnson was leaning forward as if gripped by it." Miss Thompson's voice asking Mr. Johnson various questions about the project by name flowed out. Well, manager, how was this?" Mr. Johnson's voice continued, stammering pathetically. With his shameful behavior exposed, he hung his head and let out a groan, as if holding back tears. "Mr. Johnson, do you not understand this project?" Noticing Mr. Johnson's abnormality, Miss Thompson pressed him. CEO also demanded, trembling, "What is the meaning of this?" He only growled lowly and didn't try to utter any meaningful words. "I sincerely apologize. His blunder this time is entirely my responsibility." The one who broke the tense atmosphere was not Mr. Johnson himself, but the department manager. He bent his waist and deeply apologized to Miss Thompson, but her eyes were cold, showing no sign of accepting the apology. Perhaps thinking this wasn't enough, the department manager began to kneel down. He was trying to apologize sincerely. Then, Mr. Johnson finally opened his mouth. "Manager, please stop," he shouted in a tearful voice, and the department manager stopped moving entirely. Instead, he himself vigorously rubbed his knees and forehead against the floor. "It's all my responsibility. I'm truly sorry." Miss Thompson, who had been intently staring at the top of his head, made eye contact with me. I looked at the faces of CEO and the department manager and nodded. The plan could be called a success. Miss Thompson took a step closer to Mr. Johnson, who still showed no sign of raising his face, bent down a little, and spoke to him. "I'm not the one you should be apologizing to." The intimidation from earlier had disappeared from her voice. It was like a teacher guiding a student who had done something wrong. Mr. Johnson slowly raised his upper body and faced the CEO. Then, the CEO shook his head loosely from side to side. "That's not it, right? Think carefully." This time, he turned to face the department manager. "Mr. Johnson, who received a question, is it really me?" turned towards me, gritting his teeth. A complex emotion could be seen, a mixture of frustration and self-reproach. "Sanders, my attitude towards you was completely unacceptable as a boss and as a person. I'm truly, truly sorry." Seeing that, the indignation towards him that had been rigidly accumulating in a corner of my heart diminished a little, and my heart felt lighter. I accepted the apology, lightly placed my hand on Mr. Johnson's back, and made him stand up. Thank you, thank you." He thanked me while crying for being forgiven. As he repeatedly apologized and expressed gratitude, I muttered, "We're even now." I don't know if that voice reached him. In my head, I was recalling the time when Miss Thompson brought me my business card holder. The proposal I received from her at that time was to uncover the mystery of Mr. Johnson. She repeatedly told me that my presentation was truly good. She said it was hard to believe I was a newbie or a subordinate of Mr. Johnson who couldn't answer anything. Hearing that, I had told her the truth, how I came to join a company, how I was looked down on by Mr. Johnson, and how the presentation was an unreasonable request and completely impromptu. Then, Miss Thompson's eyes widened upon hearing that. To be able to give such a presentation impromptu, excuse me, but what was your previous job? I was embarrassed but happy to have her take interest like that, so I honestly chattered about myself. My previous job was sales at a small company. It was a place that took me in as a high school graduate, so I worked desperately, but it eventually went bankrupt. When a certain person found out about that, they hired me. That was the CEO of a company where I currently work. Actually, I originally knew him, and he trusted my abilities as a salesperson, so he hired me. After joining the company, I didn't talk much to those around me about my previous job or how I came to a company. I didn't want them to think it was through connections. Without thinking, I got carried away and let slip to Miss Thompson about Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson apparently wasn't like that before. When I said what I heard from Mr. Carter, her eyebrow twitched upward. From there, it led to the proposal to expose the truth about Mr. Johnson. It was something I wanted to know myself, so I agreed to it. Her plan was secretly conveyed to the CEO and the department manager. A meeting without me was set up, and then she and her male subordinate made a surprise visit. It was all arranged. Why did they do such a roundabout thing? It was because Mr. Johnson only showed a good face to the superiors. At first, the CEO and the others seemed to find it hard to believe that Mr. Johnson was doing terrible things to me. However, they came to believe it after hearing my and Miss Thompson's words. "Mr. Johnson, it seems you've been making fun of sinners until now, but he's not incompetent at all." The CEO revealed to the hanging head of Mr. Johnson what kind of person I was. Then, perhaps realizing his own foolishness, Mr. Johnson burst into tearful laughter, and collapsed on the spot. Some time after that, Mr. Johnson resigned. He himself had worked hard and attained his position, so he was actually a very capable employee. That's why the CEO tried to settle it with a demotion and pay cut, and I agreed, but he couldn't accept it. He left the company of his own will. Mr. Carter ended up taking the vacant Mr. Johnson's seat, moving from the desk next to mine. Then another day, a letter arrived at the company. It was addressed to me, so Mr. Carter handed it to me. In the sender's field was the name William Johnson. Wondering what it could be, I opened the envelope with a bit of nervousness. Inside was a handwritten apology letter. In strong, angular letters, the writing was neatly arranged down to the very bottom line of the stationery. I gasped, recognizing the handwriting. The task Mr. Johnson had asked me to do, which was quite difficult for me at the time. The handwriting was exactly the same as the memo accompanying the gift on that night when I stayed until almost the last train. According to the letter, Mr. Johnson had decided to write me a letter because he wanted to apologize again. The reason he had taken that attitude was jealousy. He had graduated from a good university, got a job, was trusted by his subordinates, and everything was going well until one day I showed up. "You were surprisingly talented, and I thought my position might be in jeopardy. So I didn't know what to do and did those things to protect my position." So that's how it was. Tears were automatically overflowing from my eyes as I finished reading the letter. Even though he did those things, he may have had an internal conflict between protecting himself and supporting me. The bagel and milk resurfaced in my mind. After carefully putting the stationery back in the envelope, I placed it inside the folder I always carry with me. Many things happened, but I'll face forward and do my best. Maybe the day will come when I missed a bagel and milk from that night, I thought as I lowered my eyes.